Good morning, everybody. Hey, thanks. Thanks so much for being here to discuss this very important topic. My name's Jenna Koloski. I work for the Vermont Council on Rural Development, but I'm also the president of the Vermont Community Development Association Board. And on behalf of the board, I want to welcome you all here. So the VCDA is an organization that brings folks together every year, people that are working on behalf of communities across Vermont. And we organize 2 events every year on topics that are important to Vermont communities. And, typically our topics kind of focus around economic development, housing, recreation, transportation, those types of things. And this year, when we started to talk about the conversation that we wanted to have this spring, at first this topic around community strategies to address substance abuse and addiction, it is, for all of us, a little bit outside of our expertise. And we certainly called on some help to pull this day together. But really, this is such a fundamental issue to community development, to economic vitality. We see this, you all know, we see this impacting individuals and communities across the state at kind of all aspects of community and economic development. So we thought it was a critical conversation, and I think hopefully this will be a day that we can come together and learn together and share. And I know that I have a lot to learn from you all about this topic. So thank you for being a part of the conversation. The goal today is really to look at what can we do as community leaders, as municipal leaders, as folks that are supporting communities and supporting addiction and substance abuse recovery and prevention. What can we do when we come together and look at effective strategies? We know in the community development world that the communities that identify critical issues and then really kind of agree that this is something we're going to work on together and then reach out and access the resources they need, we know that that's where communities succeed and where communities can really get things done. So that's the goal today. We want to look at all aspects of this issue. We will discuss the issue and what it means for communities, but we'll also get into some effective strategies. So we'll look at housing, we'll look at transportation, we'll look at what business leaders can do and how this impacts the quality of life in communities and in businesses. So really excited for the conversation. There's a few things that I want to go over really quickly. First, I do really want to mention that the VCDA is a membership organization. We put these events on through the support of our members, and many of you are members, and we thank you for being a part of the organization. If you're not a member, we would love for you to join, and there's information at the little round table in the back there. You can also talk to Mary at the table up front here. Or you can talk to some of our board members. And I'll just quickly recognize the board members that are here today from the VCDA. If you could just stand and wave really quickly. So Jenna Koloski, I'm the president of the board. We also have Ian Jacobs, who's in the back of the table there, from CEDO in Burlington. Paul Hunt from the Community Loan Fund right here. We have Chip Sawyer, who's hosting us today from the city of St. Albans in the back. Elise Schonbacher, sitting right here, the executive director of Addison County Community Trust, and then Elijah Massey from USDA Rural Development here in the front. So if you have questions about the organization or would like to become a member, feel free to see those folks or see Mary in the back. The other thing that I want to mention, we do rely on our members to put these events together, but we also rely on sponsors that make these events possible. And I am going to recognize leaders from these organizations right before the break this morning, but just to mention them quickly, thank you to the Northwest Regional Planning Commission for sponsoring, the City of St. Albans, the Vermont Community Loan Fund, the Vermont Agency of Commerce and Community Development, Northwestern Medical Center, and the Franklin County Industrial Development Corporation. So a round of applause quickly for our sponsors, make it possible. Thank you. All right, and so I would love to kick off the day by introducing our host here in St. Albans. Mayor Tim Smith is a key community leader here in the city, but also supporting community leaders across Franklin County. He's been with the Franklin County Industrial Development Corporation for 18 years, was elected mayor here in St. Albans in 2018. He's also a critical voice on the Vermont community, the VCRD, the Vermont Council on Rural Development, getting my acronyms mixed this morning, board, and we deeply appreciate you hosting us today. Thank you, Mayor Tim Smith.
Thank you, Jenna. I'd like to welcome everyone to St. Albans. I'm born and raised here. The sort of rejuvenation in St. Albans has really made me proud, but it's been a long road. A couple things I'd share with you. I'm a little bit on a high right now, although my wife tells me I speak in monotone, so you probably never would realize that. But I just got a text from a friend who owns an ice cream shop, and this year he created the Mayor Tim Smith Sundae, and yesterday it was the biggest seller, so I'm pretty excited about that. For those who are interested, it's a brownie, it's a blonde brownie, vanilla ice cream, caramel topping, whipped cream. And then he asked me, he says, is there anything else we need on that? And I said, well, you should probably throw some M&Ms on it. So we got M&Ms. So from what I understand, it was the top seller yesterday, so I'm pretty excited. Another thing was when I ran for mayor, there was no competition. And then there was a last-minute write-in campaign that was generated by my 9-year-old son, Duffy. And he put together a campaign. He called it a write-up campaign, as opposed to a write-in campaign. And he did get 32 votes, and it made me a little nervous as to who the 32 were that voted for a 9-year-old kid. But we had fun with it. It's something he'll remember for a long time. There's not a day that goes by where I don't hear from someone that says how great the city looks. Visitors, residents, and that's no exaggeration. Almost every day I hear from someone about how great the city looks. And it's been a long road. You know, we've had a great team. I think St. Albans and Franklin County are known for collaboration. I look around the room, and I see Catherine Dimitrick and her staff from regional planning, FCIDC, the city. Chip has played a huge role in that. City manager Dominic Cloud had a great vision for the city. But it hasn't always been like this. It's been, we think back 10 years ago when then Mayor Marty Manhan worked with Senator Leahy's office to bring the Senate Judicial Committee here for a hearing in St. Albans. And it was based on the drug issues that were prevalent here in the county. A lot of people thought we were crazy for taking that initiative and bringing it to the forefront. I think everyone in the city thought it was the right thing to do, and even to this day we think even more so that it's a great thing. It was a great thing we did to shed light on the problem of which you're going to be discussing today. We took a lot of heat. A lot of people said, well, you know, why do you want to live in St. Albans? You have a lot of issues. But through the hard work of the committees and the partners in the region, we've been able to turn that around. That's not to say we still don't have problems, but we you know, through the work of the police department, we expended more dollars for a street crimes unit to address some of those issues. And I think we're really making some headway. We have a long ways to go. We understand that. But we have partners in the hospital, NCSS, I see Melinda here, Jody. I mean, these people have boots on the ground. Wait, I'm getting a cue from my campaign manager. Notch, thank you, Andy. So there's a lot of partners in this that are making a difference every day, and we're very fortunate to have that. Let me just see what give you a couple good feeling stories and how far we've come. I had a computer technician working on my computers at work on a Saturday. He left to go over to the coffee shop. He was walking into the coffee shop, and two people were sitting outside. They had a dog. He was patting their dog. He struck up a conversation, and he said to them, "Where are you folks from?" And they said, "We're from Spain." He said, "Oh, really, Spain? That's interesting." He didn't pursue the conversation, but he went inside, he got his coffee, and there was another couple there, and he said, "Where are you folks from?" And they said, "Bulgaria." And they said, "Really, Bulgaria? What brings you here to St. Albans?" And he said, "Well, we flew into Boston, we drove to Montreal to visit friends, and those friends told us, when you head back to Boston, you make sure you stop in St. Albans." I mean, that's the word of mouth that we've seen, the success. We just, the council had an interview yesterday with an individual who wants to be on the downtown board. Moved here from Jericho. He moved here because of the walkability of the city. He moved here about what the city has to offer. One of my goals as mayor is to have a major event every month, a community event every month that brings people out, and we can interact and have a great time. So we've had events like the Tractor Parade, the Festival of Trees, Running of the Bells, the Maple Festival, obviously, In Good Taste is a local producers event, St. Patrick's Day Parade, Wine and Cheese Festival, trick-or-treating, and the list goes on. And from my perspective, it's important to recreate the community aspect of the towns that we live in Vermont. And I think we're doing a great job here in St. Albans. The team is wonderful. Everyone's committed to improving the city and making it a place that people want to move to, and we're seeing that. So we're very proud of that. The community's proud. As I said, it's been a long road, but we love showcasing the community and the county. There's a lot of good stuff going on in Swanton. There's a lot of good stuff going on in Enosburg as well, Montgomery. So we're very fortunate to have a lot of grassroots efforts moving forward. So with that, I'll leave that. I'll turn it back over to Jenna, I believe. Once again, thank you all. If you have a moment, Chip and I are always willing to give tours of this building, which was renovated 3 years ago. We've had the addition of the streetscape, parking garage, state office building, hotel, and a number of other renovations. So if you get a chance, take a drive around town. It's been a great transformation over the last 6 or 8 years, and we're proud of it. So thank you for coming. We appreciate it, and hope you have a good day.
Thank you, Mayor. And we've seen all over the state, St. Albans has certainly been a shining example of revitalization and community leadership. So we appreciate being here. And later in the day, we're actually going to hear from folks in Franklin County specifically about the strategies that are going on here around substance abuse and addiction. So we're looking forward to hearing that. First, we do want to look at the topic of housing and how housing can play a critical role in the road to recovery. We have two presenters here today. We'll hear from Eileen Peltier. Eileen is the Executive Director of Downstreet Housing and Community Development. She's a key leader around housing and social equity, as well as food and health access for all Vermonters. And I will mention, for all of the speakers today, in your packets, you'll find full detailed bios and contact info there if you wanted to follow up. And we're also going to hear from Jeffrey Moreau, who's the Executive Director of the Vermont Alliance for Recovery Residences. And they are committed to supporting those in recovery from substance abuse disorders by improving access to recovery residences. So Eileen and Jeff, great to have you, and thank you so much.
Thank you. So what Tim didn't mention to you is he rents space to Ben & Jerry's in the industrial park. So I don't know, Tim, is this flavor going to be available in pints? I'm not sure if, Tim, is Ben & Jerry's going to package your ice cream? Oh, okay. It's a Hood ice cream. He's in trouble now. This is on TV. I, like Tim, am originally from St. Albans and just delighted to be here today. I've seen a lot of good friends, and thank you for having us. I'd like to start off by sharing with you that my grandfather had a substance use disorder. It was alcohol. Today, we're here to talk a lot about opiates and heroin and even the deadly fentanyl. And I implore all of us to think about this in terms of addiction and not walk away from this once we address this awful epidemic. We need to stick with this because there's always going to be an addiction. It's the substance that's going to change. So we need to, as we build communities, create systems that are going to wrap around people and help them with prevention, treatment, and recovery. So I wanted to start off on that note. I also wanted to mention that I'm realizing now it's going to be incredibly hard to see this slideshow. So I've left some cards on the little table in the back. And if anyone wants a copy, there's a lot of rich data in this presentation. I'll be happy to email that to you. So we'll go ahead and get started. The first slide says addictions are chronic conditions like asthma or diabetes with similar rates of relapse and opportunities for recovery. And I think that's an important starting point. My grandfather had a disease, and sometimes we treat people in a way like, what's wrong with them? And just like diabetes or high blood pressure, he needed some help. We also are seeing people dying at alarming rates. I'm going to click through about 24 slides very quickly, but what I want to highlight for you is pay attention to how the red develops through these slides. These are people that are dying as a result of opiate overdoses. So this is in 2003. Let's go back to that. Very scary and sad. The number of opiate overdoses has tripled since 2000 to 2015. That's from 11,000 lives to 33,000 lives. And we've seen similar results here in Vermont, unfortunately. There's been some great work that I know Jolinda LeClaire will speak about in terms of the state, but the results aren't getting that much better. We're still losing people. I'm going to skip over this because for some reason a couple of the lines aren't showing, but just real quickly, this demonstrates the cause of death between car accidents, HIV, guns, and overdoses. And as you can imagine, that top line is the overdoses. A couple of the lines aren't showing. So in Vermont, we have about 52,000 people that are affected by substance use disorder, and that represents 1 in 10 individuals age 12 and over. That's an incredible stat. 3/4 of Vermonters are in treatment, are receiving Medicaid, and are of extremely low income. And the rates of SUD is greatest among Vermonters aged 18 to 25. Within that cohort, 22.7% have an SUD. This shows the number of drug-related fatalities involving opiates. Again, fentanyl being the deadliest impactor with that white line. And this is a look at New England. The white line, the bottom one, is Vermont. So you can see the stats are relatively consistent. I think New Hampshire, the top line, is the one that's most devastating. So this is a typical substance use history of participants, starting with cigarette smoking, drinking, prescription abuse, and leading to heroin. I share this slide more in the sense that we were at the State House last week talking about prevention. And we were honoring great people doing prevention work. Beth Crane from this community was recognized. And upstairs in one of the House committees, they were debating marijuana legalization sale again. And we thought that was dead for this year, but now it has legs. And I just think personally, I'm speaking on my own behalf, I just think we have to really take a hard look at that if we're serious about dealing with addiction. We're all familiar now with the hub and spoke model, which has really delivered exceptional results. I think there are some gaps in this, and housing being one of them. And Eileen will validate that for you. So the final slide that I have shows the number of folks that are receiving medically assisted treatment. And I recognize that's not for everybody, but for those that need that and choose that as part of their recovery, we now can offer that service. And I served on the federal grand jury for 2 years. And I can't tell you how many young people sat and testified in front of us saying, I'm here, I did heroin this morning before I came to talk to you, and I can't get into treatment. And that was about 2 years ago. So I want everyone to give yourselves a round of applause, because now my understanding, in most cases, anyone that wants to get into treatment today can do so. So congratulations. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Eileen, and she's going to walk you through a report that her organization, Downstreet Housing and Development, put together in terms of those folks in recovery and the housing needs that they have. Eileen?
Good morning, everyone. So again, my name is Eileen Peltier, and I'm the Executive Director at Downstreet Housing and Community Development, and we are the affordable housing provider for Central Vermont. And I'm really excited that the Vermont Community Development Association is having this conversation, because I got to tell you, at the end of the day, the most important thing is community. For people in recovery, for people currently dealing with addiction, it is all about community. When we think about poverty, it's about community. So when Josh Hanford called me in January after hearing us talk about this report and said, what do you think about having this group talk about it? I said, it's absolutely critically important. And recently I spoke to the Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission, which is small towns all around Central Vermont, Calais, Woodbury. Every single head was nodding. I mean, this is real in every community, and I think Jeff, helped us to all understand that this is probably the most significant community crisis we are dealing with right now in Vermont. And there's lots of reasons. Part of it is just the nature of being a rural state. And there's lots of reasons that Vermont is dealing with this challenge. It's geographically where we are on the corridor up 91. I worked 20 years ago in HIV/AIDS, and we were having similar conversations. So to echo Jeff's comment, the opioids are the new flavor of the month, and they are a deadly flavor of the month, and they are getting our attention. But substance use disorder has been around for a very, very long time. And, if there's anything remotely good about opioids, is that it's got us all in this room having this conversation, and it can't stop when the drug manufacturers move on to something else, right? Because they will, and they're already thinking about what comes next. So I'm thrilled that you're all here today and you valued this important conversation. So housing, which is my work, when we were looking at this work through the Opioid Coordination Council, very early on, we were hearing from everybody that affordable housing and sober living environments didn't exist in enough places around the state. It's a huge challenge. Just to let you know, Vermont has the 5th largest affordability gap in the country, meaning the amount of money you make compared to what it costs to rent an apartment there's a big gap there. So we're the 5th worst in the country. So, and I say that because I think a lot of times people think that Vermont is this idyllic, amazing place, and it is. Let's be clear, even on a dreary day, St. Albans looks wonderful. But we have real challenges. So when we started looking at this, we realized as affordable housing developers, we weren't in this conversation about substance use disorder. And just to note, I'm saying substance use disorder, and if you take nothing away from the day, I hope you can take the transition from substance abuse to substance use, right? It is a disease. Substance abuse implies a lot more choice than people have when they're dealing with a disease. And there's a great presentation you should all be bringing to your communities and your staff around the language of addiction and how we talk about it. So. Housing exists at the intersection of recovery and treatment and prevention. It's circular. Jolinda will talk about this. It's all important at every stage of it. So what is recovery housing? The term is recovery residence, and Jeff didn't introduce his organization, but the Vermont Alliance of Recovery Residents is the new organization. Jeff is the founding executive director that will be looking at how we certify recovery residents, which is an important thing. But that tells you how unprepared the state is for this piece of work around housing. We didn't have an agency that was certifying and thinking about this. It isn't like the designated agencies for mental health where there's an existing structure statewide. So we have a lot of work to do. But what it is basically a safe alcohol and drug-free environment, that meaning non-prescribed drugs are okay in most recovery residents, particularly in the opioid crisis when people need to be on medication assisted, on MAT treatment. We have to be able to manage that. And what I would say it is an opportunity to come out of treatment into a safe community, a little bit in a bubble for a little bit while, right? It's not quite real world, but you can come home and not have the challenge of people actively using in your environment. Not only that, you have people who are dealing with the same challenges, and the level of peer support is truly unbelievable. And recovery residents do have house managers, and there are other people around and involved, but it is primarily a peer support model. When I first looked at the Phoenix House in Burlington years ago, so Downstreet operates recovery residence in South Barry. Actually, I should say we own it. It's operated by Phoenix House, and we went and toured the Phoenix House in Burlington, and sitting with these 10 men, we were talking about, well, what happens and, how do you know when someone's actively using, and what do you do? And they are like, we know. Are you kidding me? We know way before, anybody else. And they deal with it, and they support each other because they're all there with the best intentions to do well, and we're all going to fail in life. Part of life is failure, and they're there for each other, and they support each other. So it's an environment that's going to give somebody an opportunity to thrive, and it takes a long time to get there. So who is it for? People actively working to live, coming out of treatment, to live their lives a certain way. It's really about stabilization for a period of time, and then there is an expectation that you can then essentially graduate from that environment and move into, into the community in a more, outside of the sober living environment. There's support services, there's help with employment. Part of it is going through the Vermont Recovery Network. The Turning Point centers all across the state provide services for people so they can get out, go interact. To me, the Turning Point is sort of like the community space, right? It's what we offer in our communities where people can come and be supported both by other people in recovery and others. So I think those are critically important aspects of the whole continuum of work that the state of Vermont is doing, and we should be supporting them, and we should be encouraging our communities to have beautiful Turning Point centers like St. Albans, as I got an opportunity to see it a few months back. It's a beautiful space that's welcoming, and that's important to somebody in recovery because it says you're worthy, and that is one of the biggest things that we as a community can say to people. So basically, we know that sober living environments work. It makes sense. And all in all, basically, what we're going to say here is that your likelihood of staying in recovery, not using again, goes up by having this opportunity to live in this environment. I know we don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to So, A year ago, the Opioid Coordination Council said, we got a big hole where recovery residents are supposed to be in the state of Vermont. Jolinda's going to talk about the many good things that we have going on in the state. So I said, at that time, my colleague was a member of the Opioid Coordination Council, and she came to me and said, Eileen, we can't screw around like you do when you take 4 years to build a building. I know St. Albans is hopefully going to be welcoming a building, a rehab that Champlain Housing Trust is doing. You all probably have been hearing about that for a few years. That's our process. It's a big deal. We work with the communities. She said, we don't have time for that. We have people, we've done well with the hub and spoke. We have people coming out of treatment, having made the decision to get into treatment, gone through that tough time, come out the other side, and they're standing on the streets. I mean, what would you do if you were standing on the streets, right? You'd reach to something that feels like a comfort. So we commissioned a report, which was done by John Ryan from Development Cycles, and essentially we were at the time thinking, well, we're probably going to need like 12. I think we kind of guessed a number. Maybe we need 12 around the state. And we were pretty honestly shocked to see what you can't see up there, but what it says is that, and this is sort of the immediate need, this is the tip of the iceberg, that we need 15 more recovery residents for men and 19 for women with children. To just get us to a place where people are not walking out of treatment and ending up on, I actually heard the story in the Northeast Kingdom of an individual coming out of treatment, essentially in a snowstorm, on the streets, somehow found his way to Turning Point, who was able to help them. But I mean, that's not what we want to be doing as a community, right? So we understand there's a significant need, and that is estimated based on 6 to 8 people in each home. So the model is about 6 to 8 people in each home. So from the report, we know there's about 1,200 people in the community who would benefit from access to a recovery residence. Not everybody needs to go in a sober living environment, but we know there's at least 1,200 people. There are 212 beds currently in the state, many of which are run, some are more professional nonprofits like a Phoenix House or an Oxford House, and many of them are people who have had this experience and recognize that their family member, their friend needed to be in a sober living environment and honestly just created it. They took a house and they created it because they were passionate, they were concerned. So it's a classic Vermont grassroots approach. And so to have those kinds of houses and a very small system essentially in the state right now, and to scale it up to be able to serve 1,200 people is a big task. And that's the work that we're currently doing. So right now, 73% of the existing beds are reserved for men, 24 for women. Despite the fact that women currently make up 42% of Vermonters dealing with substance use disorder. 65% of the current recovery residence beds are in Chittenden County, though it makes up 24% of the need. And that is not to say, I could go back to the other slide, Chittenden County actually still needs more recovery residents. They don't have too many. They've just done some good work and established them. And getting back to community, being able to recover in your community where you have friends and family and support is critically important. So a big part of this work is really scaling this out, not just the numbers, but across the state. And that slide back there really specifically talks about what communities need what. So, recovery residence for women and women with children. This was something that probably you, boots on the ground people know this. It was a, wow moment when we saw the report. And in fact, the author of the report called me halfway through and said, you gotta start thinking about what to do with women with children. And I'll tell you a little story. My police chief in the city of Barrie met with him a couple years ago about developing a recovery residence. And, police chiefs, I expected him to say, well, I'm going to need more little police capacity and I'm going to need this. And I knew that he, obviously cared deeply about the community and he was going to be supportive in the end. But at the end of our conversation, he was getting ready to leave and he kind of just grabbed my shoulders and he said, Eileen, if you do one thing, get these women away from challenging situations and get them in housing. Do something for women and do something for women with children. That's where we see the biggest need. So I wasn't totally shocked, but I was shocked at the numbers. So That's an important aspect of this work. And right now we have 1 recovery residence in the state of Vermont for women with children. So VTAR. So then I started sort of thinking about what are all the pieces of the work that we need to do. So as affordable housing providers, we are making an investment, right? And we are using community assets, your tax dollars, to make those investments in our communities. So we need to make wise decisions. So I can't just, go buy a building and go, here, it's a recovery residence. I need to think through all aspects of it. So one piece was having a statewide agency that can certify these recovery, to professionalize it, to ensure that we know that our friends and family are getting the right care and the right services that they need. So that is essentially the function of VTAR. And for the past several months, we've been standing that up. And as of April 1st, we hired Jeff as the first executive director. So that was a critical piece of work to be able to build these recovery residences. So these are the kinds of things that VTAR will provide. And VTAR is part of the National Association Recovery Residents, so we are not making this up on our own. We are connecting to our colleagues around New England and around the country, and that's actually a lot of what Jeff's been doing in the past couple of months. So just really briefly, you don't need to be able to read this, but what I want to say is, so the report is looking at the need for level 1 recovery residences, which are that model I described. It's primarily peer-to-peer with a house manager who's engaged, but really, maybe only there about 8 to 10 hours a week. There are 4 different levels. The 4th level is a 24-hour services model. We haven't even begun to look at that. So again, when I said tip of the iceberg, I meant tip of the iceberg. And part of the reason we're doing level 1 first is because we knew the numbers were high need, and it's something that we could stand up a little more quickly. But there are some affordable housing agencies around the state that are looking at potentially opening level 3s or level 4s. So this was the challenge that we gave ourselves. The first thing we needed to do is go, okay, is this big hole real? We proved it, it's real. The report is available. We can share the link for that. It's incredibly comprehensive, looks, deep into communities about availability of housing and all kinds of things around this. We hired Jeff, yay, that was a very exciting moment to have him on board and doing some of that work. This is an interesting one. The partnership, I mentioned briefly, the connection between affordable housing providers and people who work in substance use disorder. So last spring, the Opioid Coordination Council convened a conversation around housing, and I didn't know anybody in the room except for my 4 colleagues that I brought with me. What's that about? I mean, I have my mental health executive director on speed dial. We work with them all the time. This is a different beast, and I will tell you, I think it's about stigma. I think it's about, the legal aspects of it, because I'm a landlord. I know that's a scary word. I don't like to call myself that, but in fact we are. So we need to break that down. The story I like to tell when I think about this is when Governor Shumlin said we need to give people options between jail and treatment. By the way, the only time I have ever sent an email to a governor to say thank you was that day. I thought, good for him to stand up and say that years ago. We need to have, as housing providers, the same option. We only have eviction. If we don't have strong partnerships with others, with the substance use providers, what are we doing, right? So we will be working on that. We'll be having a convening in the fall, bringing in substance use providers around the state. I've been communicating very regularly with all my colleagues around the state and helping them understand this challenge, that this is a big challenge in our communities and what's the role that we can play. And part of it is having those connections, because as a group, there are about 14,000 units of affordable housing in the state and 22 different affordable housing providers. And the vast majority of the individuals that we serve are low income, and the slide before mentioned that 75% of people with substance use disorder are low income. So they're also living in our housing, which is great, but we need to support them. We know that it's a little bit of a revolving door. People, 4 walls and a roof is not everything you need, right? So providing the apartment is a great first step, but if we're not helping and connecting them to services so that they can stay in that housing, that's a failure too. So that's kind of another piece of work in addition to developing these sober living environments. Another thing that Downstreet has done is I've had a lot of conversations toward recovery residences, made all the different connections, and we have developed essentially a toolkit for my colleagues of how to develop these around the state. And that is available to community members as well. So most communities around the state have some sort of opioid group. So we've been sharing it with that group. So it isn't just affordable housing people developing this. We can't do that. We work in community. We work in collaboration with community partners. So they're all looking at this together, understanding the challenges of how to do it in your community. What's the funding? What does the building need to look like? What do you do? How do you lock up Matt? What does that look like for the building? All kinds of different challenges like that, and lots of information around that. We also, of course, because many of these people are low income, we need to figure out how the rent gets paid. So that's been a significant amount of my work right now, and we're still continuing to work on that. I won't bore you with the million different potential ways that we can use vouchers or rental assistance in different ways, but that's a significant piece of the work as well, as an ongoing thing while people are living there. Often what happens in recovery residence now, and this is part of the journey of recovery, is that people may need that boost for a couple of months to have their rent paid, but then they can contribute to their rent. They're getting employed. Part of their recovery is actively being part of the community, being a good citizen, having a job. So they want, we don't necessarily want to just make it free and easy. That actually doesn't help somebody on their recovery journey. So it's not, subsidized forever, but we think that there are ways to provide what is needed so that these houses can open and operate, because we do need to be able to pay the bills as well. Really briefly, I'll mention the Family SASH pilot. I don't know if people have heard of SASH, which is Support and Services at Home. It is a program for Medicare-eligible seniors and young disabled. It's a nationally recognized program that started right here in Vermont. Right now it's being piloted in 40 sites around the country by Housing and Urban Development. So we would like to take this, it's essentially that acknowledging that 4 walls and a roof are not enough. We need to care coordination, connect people to the services they need so that they can thrive. So it's using, though, that housing, that congregate housing setting as a platform for those services. So you can imagine there's 30 residents living together and there's a revolving door of service providers coming in and out, right? Doing lots of wonderful work, but not necessarily coordinated in a great way with each other, and certainly not with the housing provider, who might be the individual who sees something first, right? We're there. My maintenance team, I call them our social workers, because they're the boots on the ground. They go in and change a light bulb, and they can tell if somebody's using a substance or has challenges, and they kind of hold this information and don't know what to do with it. Having a SASH program where housing providers and service providers can talk to each other, it addresses the confidentiality issues and those kinds of things, is an incredible opportunity for us to support people. So we are looking at doing something for families, because the SASH is, for Medicare eligible, and we think a significant piece of that might be working with recovery coaches. Bringing them into our housing, having that kind of level of support right in our housing, again, to retain people in those 14,000 units across the state who are struggling with substance use disorder. And then lastly, I'll mention the R for R initiative, and that's where the easiest thing that all of you can do as community members, as individuals, is support this effort. Talk about the stigma part of it. Talk about the fact that substance use disorder is a disease, much like diabetes is. The Attorney General says that. Mark Levine, our Commissioner of Health, goes around the state and says it. There's a wonderful presentation you can see about the brain science of it. But we are still not really there as a culture. I'm guessing the people in this room are, but we need to talk and tell that story and let people know that, because there are a lot of aha moments in that. So R for R is about building this sort of coalition of support that says, I get that, and I want to do something to help and be part of that. And the biggest thing you can do is to help address stigma. After working in HIV/AIDS for a long time around the issues of stigma, I think that's the most important long-term strategy to help people in recovery. So this is just a slide that kind of looks at all the different work that we are doing. So a few more ways that you can help. At the end of the day, part of this challenge is just about needing funding for affordable housing and having the 5th largest affordability gap. So it's always helpful to do that. And then, of course, there is some legislation, some related to zoning, some related to how the houses will operate that are important, and works that will be relevant to communities as we begin to roll these out, but that's just another piece of the effort. And like I said, lastly and most importantly, share your story, support this work, advocate on behalf of not only the individuals, families, friends who are struggling with substance use disorder, but our communities as well. This is something that we need to do together, and it's important work, and I'm glad that you are all here and wanting to have this conversation today. So I'm going to end it there, and then I don't know where we are in time. I know we started a few minutes late, but do we have time for questions? Or?
Yeah, why don't I? So thank you so much, Eileen and Jeff. And I think we do need to move on to our next speaker, but maybe 1 or 2 questions, if anybody has something they want to ask. Yeah. 1 second. Let me just come to.
Can you tell us more about the housing CHT is going to be doing here in St. Albans on Maiden Lane, and how is this program going to be incorporated there? I know that SASH is in almost all of CHT housing.
Right, so that is affordable housing, as far as I know. It's an Leah, you might know more, but it's an affordable housing development. It will not be a sober living environment, but I know Champlain Housing Trust is looking at St. Albans to open another sober living environment for women with children. Separate, yes, because of course, those are people living independently. They want to have a glass of wine at the end of the day, they can do that. It needs to be separate, and the model of like 6 to 8. So typically these are houses that, are in your community. You don't necessarily know what's happening there, right? That people are choosing to live that way. So, but they are looking at that project too.
So just one more quick question.
Thank you. I had a question about the new organization that Jeff is running. So I'm not familiar with the national organization, but we do have the Vermont Foundation of Recovery that also helps manage some of the sober homes around. Andrew Gagne has been a huge advocate. How does a coordination of those two work or look like?
That's another piece of the puzzle that I can explain. So Vermont Foundation of Recovery is a service provider, right? So David and Andrew came to me a couple years ago and said, we've got to scale this thing up, right? So that's part of the reason we got involved in this conversation. Jeff's agency is going to certify organizations like the Vermont Foundation of Recovery. So all working very closely together, but we need to, have some of that separation.
Well, thank you so much, Eileen and Jeff. We really appreciate it. Did you have a final word?
I mentioned I have my cards in the back of the room for the presentation, but Eileen's mentioned a couple of other resources as well, including her report and the toolkit. Any of that you folks would like, we can send to you electronically. So feel free to grab those cards. I did notice that many of you were good students and brought pen and paper. So if you do want to write down, the easiest email, if you forget to get the card, is info@vtarr.org. So it's the VTAR. And just feel free to email us and let us know how we can help you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And also, I'll just mention, I don't know if this is true, but Elise, correct me if I'm wrong. We could post all this stuff on our website, right? Okay, so on the VCDA website, we can post the presentations and the links that Jeff mentioned, so we can have that all available and send it out to attendees for you. So moving on, our next speaker. So we have Melinda White with us. She's the Medical Assistance Treatment Coordinator at the Northwestern Medical Center. And Melinda's here to share her story of long-term recovery with us. She serves on many organizations, local and statewide, in support of helping the community's most vulnerable people, and has committed her life to sharing her story and supporting others struggling with addiction. So we deeply appreciate your insight and perspective on this, and join me in welcoming Melinda White.
Thank you so much. Good morning. So my phone isn't here so I can tweet or Twitter. It's just to keep track of the time because I don't want to go over the time. And I'll do a little disclaimer. So when I share today, it's not because of where I work or what organizations I'm connected to. This is my personal journey. So I just want to get that disclaimer out of the way. So my name is Melinda White. I'm a person in long-term recovery. What that means to me is that I haven't had to use a mood or mind-altering substance since December 28, 2011. Thank you. That's not my victory. That's the victory of the people that helped me. And as much as I try not to spend a lot of time in the quote stories, I'm just going to touch on a little bit of that journey to identify as being a person who needed to get into recovery. So for me, my path began with alcohol. I love how it's being highlighted that this is substance use disorder. Try not to focus so much on the substance, but the fact that it could be anything. For me, it was alcohol when I was younger. I got my first DWI at the age of 18, coming back from Canada, because of course I was a drinking age in Canada, but it was illegal in the States. And it was definitely not on my radar that I could potentially have somebody with a brain disease of alcoholism. So when I turned 21 in St. Albans, because I am a St. Albans native, I got my first DWI in this state. And it's interesting how the denial was already implanted in my being without really understanding it. I blamed it on the fact that the city was too well lit, so I forgot to turn on my lights, and that's why I got pulled over, was because my lights weren't turned on. Since I've been sober, I have not forgotten to turn my lights on at night, so I realized that was, again, one of the excuses that I would make, that it's not because I drank too much, it's this, and this, it's everything else but the substance. So a few years later, of course, there was nobody in my family that has substance use disorder, so it wasn't on our radar. I was raised in a what I consider a great family, raised through it, in the church. I was a straight A student, so a lot of things externally would never make our family think like Melinda might end up becoming a drug addict and alcoholic. But after those two DWIs, it was on the radar that, you might have a drinking problem. And of course, that's not anything with somebody with substance use disorder wants to hear, because at the time, I hadn't hit a bottom to really think it was too big of a problem. And I got introduced to opiates through having my wisdom teeth taken out. A lot of the common ways that other people have been introduced to them. I'd, cracked some ribs, gotten opiates. So they were definitely on my radar at that point in time. And the other thing that I liked about them is that I didn't smell like alcohol, so I couldn't get caught as easily if I needed to do a few opiates to get through my day. So this was a way to justify it. I had already gotten those two DWIs, and in my mid-20s, I got another DWI. And at this point, I was in a really low place in my life, going through a divorce, no longer had supervision by that partner to keep my use in check, and it was on. I was working for a great organization in this community, A. and Deringer. They were amazing, and I was part of an EAP program. And of course, not wanting to admit that I had a problem, the fear of the stigma and the judgment, and also the fear of just not understanding what that issue was, it made me hold back for a long time. But I got that third DWI. My roadside BAC was a 0.38, and I was functioning well. That's the sign of tolerance. That's not because I'm running with the big dogs and I can hold my liquor. That's because I have alcoholism, and I can continue to drink and function fairly normally, which is not a good quality to have. When I was younger, it was a badge of honor. At this age, in my mid-20s, it wasn't a badge of honor. It was scary. So I got to a point where I was extremely low internally, and when we hear about people needing to hit bottom, this is only my opinion. There's no way for anybody else to know what my bottom is except me, because it's not because of the external circumstances, the bottom is within. So at that time, externally, that was what looked like my lowest point in life. And I was pretty close to that. I ended up overdosing intentionally, and I went to Brattleboro Retreat, and that was my first introduction to treatment. I remember hearing relapse as a part of recovery, and that scared the heck out of me, because that was giving me permission to pick up again. And I was really frustrated with hearing that. The downside to me being so standoffish about hearing that is that the first time I did relapse, I was blown away, baffled, and I ended up taking off. I was under the influence, called my mom. I said, I messed up again. I'm going back to Brattleboro Retreat. I was under the influence, and there was, usually when I see Chief Gary Taylor, because I've spoken at some things and he's there, and I always say sorry about that, because there was a missing persons report filed. I disappeared for 3 days. So this is a family disease. My family went through this with me. I went back to Brattleboro, did a little bit of time in their program, but I knew I needed more. And, when we look at like the ACEs, I definitely score on the ACEs scale, but I don't blame the trauma, my addiction on the trauma. I think that helped it skyrocket a little bit faster, but at the end of the day, that's not the reason that I used. It's because I had a brain disease that I didn't understand. So at that point, I ended up going to a program called Teen Challenge. There is a men's, and it's called Teen Challenge, but it's for adults. There's a men's home in the state of Vermont, but there's no women's home. So I went to Germantown, Philadelphia, which was a very interesting experience, very different than St. Albans, Vermont. Saw a lot of crime, saw a lot of scary stuff, but was protected. That program is a minimum of a year. I did 13 months. And what I learned, and there's no medication in that program. What I learned in that program is exactly what I needed. I feel like some people really need a loving approach to sustain recovery. They need a gentle approach. I'm not one of those people. I needed to get my butt squared away. Like, I needed discipline. I needed it bad. I needed somebody to be clear, not hard and abusive on me, but clear about this is what you can and can't do, this is what the options are. So in Teen Challenge, I learned a lot about discipline. In the beginning, I couldn't understand why tucking my bed in so you can bounce quarter or you get work hours if you don't do it, or why rolling my clothes would keep me sober, why doing chores would keep me sober, why discipline would keep me sober. But as I went through that program, I learned so much. I remember getting a discipline slip for something that I didn't do. It was somebody else's job, and when I mentioned it to the staff, they doubled the work hours. And I was shoveling snow in a long skirt, raking leaves, all these different things, but it gave me a chance to think. And I remember when I got a slip for something I did not do, but I didn't dare to tell that staff because I didn't want the hours doubled. When I connected with my counselor later, I said, you realize that wasn't my job, and she gave me those hours. She said, yep, but it gives you a chance to learn how to deal with an unfair circumstance in a safe setting. That's what I needed. I needed coping skills. I needed the ability to realize that if there are rules in place, if I disagree with them, I got to submit to those governing authorities, and then I can be a voice if it's something that truly could use change. Otherwise, it's not my job to judge what's fair. I like to say, expecting life to be fair is like expecting a lion not to eat me because I'm not going to eat him. It's just not realistic. So I learned a lot of good coping skills. I came back to St. Albans, and there's a program in the state of Vermont, another housing program called Covered Bridge, and there was a women's home in St. Albans. So I came home to start employment somewhat in this field. When the women's prison moved, the house moved, and then I was back to working out in the corporate world. I didn't stay connected to recovery, and eventually I ended up picking up again. And the shame that comes along with that is something I don't wish on my worst enemy. And of course, that whole fear of I can't say anything, I can't tell people. And to make a long story short, December 5th, 2011, I was trying to get off opiates on my own, went to work. I was working in Burlington. And of course, the withdrawal is horrific. And at my lunch break, I decided, well, maybe I'll just drink something, because I'd made that internal promise that I have made so many times that I'm not going to pick up this substance today. So my goal was not to pick up opiates that day, because by then I learned how to shoot dope in treatment years prior. So by then it was back to heroin. So the goal is not to use heroin, and on my lunch break I went and got a bottle of vodka thinking that'll help with the withdrawal symptoms, and of course then that messed everything up. Decided to go and get my opiates after all, and then decided not to go back to work because they didn't know how much of a disease I had. Headed back towards St. Albans and basically nodded off and drove under a semi and totaled my car, and that was my fourth DWI arrest. And it's a miracle that I survived. And that's why I say today, the reason I'm alive is to be of service to God and my fellows. The reason I'm alive is to not let the idea of stigma or judgment scare me away for standing up and being strong in this, because there's nothing anybody can say or do to me at this point in my life that's going to hurt as much as what I went through. So for me, getting in recovery, it didn't open up the gates of heaven. It just opened up the gates of hell so I could climb out. And since December 28, 2011, my life commitment is to help other people who are in need of recovery, to help the family members. What the family goes through is as painful, if not worse, than what the person who needs recovery goes through. And interestingly enough, I ended up getting a position with the Turning Point at Franklin County. And when I heard about the Turning Point when I was in treatment and thought, well, I'm not going to go there because I hear people deal drugs there. And I remember talking to somebody when I came back, and they're like, well, who told you they deal drugs there? And I said, well, somebody I met in treatment. They're like, okay, well, do you think you should see with your own eyes instead of, trust this person? And I did, and it was amazing. I immediately got connected with sober supports in the community, having the ability to have a job that was part-time at the beginning, because I'm a firm believer that employment is essential for people in recovery. I'm a very firm believer that your program has to come before your job, because you're going to lose your job if you pick up a substance. So for me, having the foundation of recovery and the time to build it, I could work part-time, and then I could invest in my recovery. And, you know, it's interesting because one of the people that helped me the most, and she's still part of my life today, one of the biggest parts of my life is a sponsor through the 12-step program. And of all of the professionals I went to with all the amazing acronyms after their name, a woman who works in a grocery store saved my life. She's been working in a grocery store 20 plus years. She doesn't have training in the field, but she's been there, done that, got the t-shirt. And I could call her and say, I'm feeling such a, you know, this kind of way, or I'm thinking this. And she's like, oh, I remember going through that. So hearing somebody who could actually identify and take all the drama out of it was huge. 3 key pieces is to recognize this problem and become 100% willing to follow all the suggestions to never have to look back. I can look at my past and I use that as a springboard. I don't use it as a hammock. I can't sit there and hang out in all the guilt and shame because it's gonna kill me, and it's hard to get out of a hammock. So I use it as a springboard to learn and move ahead. And part of my journey was to be open and honest about all the stuff that I had done, because I still had illegal stuff I had done that was killing me guilt-wise, and I needed to deal with it. She helped me make those amends in my life. She helped me take that inventory of what I had been through, what I had done, and I remember I was nervous, and I said, well, if I tell you some of the stuff I've done, you're never gonna wanna see me again. She goes, you know, I'm gonna say, if there's a name for it, somebody else out there has done it. So you're really not that unique. Having somebody who is not gonna judge me, who's not gonna put me down, who's gonna like smile and nod. You know, we say the opposite of addiction is connection. The answer to addiction is connection, and I'm a firm believer of that. Put all the science aside. If you have the time to sit with somebody who's struggling and just look at them in the eyes and just care, give them an ear, give them a strength-based approach, that is more valuable than any of the science of any of the programs out there. There's amazing programs out there, and we're fortunate to have them. But in this area, for me, it was the people. It wasn't specific programs, it was the people stepping up. I just want to check the time here. Okay. So I do want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A. I'm just going to kind of wrap up the key pieces for me that were the most helpful. It was getting involved. So getting involved in my community, being involved in the Turning Point, doing service work. And a lot of people stepped up. So we look at like transportation. We're calling them the formidable 4, the barriers that we have right now. Transportation, housing, childcare, and substance use disorder. So I got 4 DWIs. I was not allowed to drive. I still made it to different meetings and appointments. And how did I do that? By getting in the recovery center, and people who knew that I didn't have a license helped me with that. It's difficult for people in more rural areas, so we're trying to look at those different ways. And I keep looking at Ross McDonald because he's one of my heroes with the amazing work he's doing with the transportation. So I was very fortunate that I lived pretty close, that I could do a lot of walking, and that's a big thing. Quite frankly, I needed to walk a lot in the beginning so I wouldn't think so much. It would get me out of my head. Housing, I was fortunate that I could go and rent from a family member. I work with people in my current position where they're going to treatment and they come out, they have no place to live. How successful in their recovery are they gonna be? No matter how many beautiful programs you put on the other end, if they don't know where they're sleeping that night, the program's not gonna work. People need housing. Treatment and recovery, that's a huge thing. So now we don't have wait list. We are actually at our clinic, I'm at the pain clinic, and we're looking at RAM, which is rapid access to medication assisted treatment. And that is something that we haven't even formally put into place because everything takes so much time. And yet our director, Dr. White, who is a savant to me, said we had an individual coming out of jail, and I said, he is at high risk, he's not gonna be dosed for 2 days until he can get into such and such a place. She said, let's practice that today. So we really gotta stop being fearful of acting. There's a lot of great planning going on. When I took the current position I'm in, I was conflicted because I had the name medication in the word, and I don't like medication for me. The reason I don't like it is because I abuse it. The reason I didn't go on Suboxone is because the night that I was almost convinced to go on it in Maple Leaf the last time, I was thinking about, well, I got a lawyer to pay off, so maybe I'll get it and sell it. Wrong motives. So it doesn't work for me, but I've seen it save many lives too. So again, it's not about treating the disease, it's about treating the person. Every single person is different, and what their journey looks like is different. I'm blessed that I have in my family, my brother-in-law is, at the time, he was Trooper Rodriguez. So he and I would go to these family functions, you know, week after week and talk about, and of course our views, we're very passionate about our views, but as time has gone on, we've started a number of initiatives, being able to do outreach to different schools, being able to start an impanelment, which is a law enforcement impanelment in this area, and just so many different ways of him being able to see a different perspective because he finally saw somebody who actually walked the journey of recovery. And for me, finally started hanging out with a cop that didn't have me in bracelets. So it really helped open the door to partnership for me, being new in recovery at that time and trying to find where my niche is. And I can say, putting down the alcohol and the drugs, it takes the monkey off my back, but the circus is still in town. So I have to be 100% committed every single day. My day starts with prayer and meditation. It starts with affirmations and readings. And throughout the day, I have to help other people. And then it closes. And I'm at Teen Challenge, I had to pause and pray every hour on the hour. This was part of the discipline they gave us. And the women there, if you didn't, somehow they knew. I don't know if they had spy cams, but somehow they knew. And I would get discipline slips for not doing it. But what it does is it makes me stop and connect every hour on the hour in my life today. And it doesn't mean I have to go in a corner and pray some specific religious thing. It's about stopping and connecting, getting balanced, because I don't know what another person's journey in recovery is supposed to look like, but I know that if I have a role in it, God brings them to me, and I need to support them. And it could look different, and I cannot allow any bias to get in the way of that, because I have learned so much in this field. So I'm going to stop there as far as my story goes to make sure there's enough time for questions. And one other disclaimer, sometimes people have questions that feel like a hard question, and they don't want to embarrass the person or make them uncomfortable. Again, there's nothing anybody can ask me that is going to scare me away. This is the time to get those hard questions out. There's none? All right. Sure.
So first of all, thank you for sharing your story. And I just wonder, you mentioned getting involved was important. And for a lot of people here that kind of work in community and economic development world, how can communities kind of create an environment for folks to get involved? Like what was kind of available to you to draw you in and stay connected and feel that you could participate?
Great question. So for me, one of the things that was helpful was the faith-based community. I was a member of the church, am a member of the Church of the Rock, and play music on the music team there. And there's a lot of different activities that church does. So I encourage people to try to connect with their faith-based communities. And there's that misconception. You don't have to be a religious person or have to, just go and connect with people and just be open-minded to maybe some different things you could hear or learn. Because there's a lot of activities that are put on, different community dinners and whatnot. The other thing was through the Turning Point, through the Recovery Center. The local recovery center has a lot of different opportunities for people who need to, say, do some service work making coffee for a recovery meeting. They've got everything from 12-step to peer-led groups. There's a lot of different things, so nobody's stuck in one path of recovery. They're really good about that. And in addition, actually, Tammy DeFranco works in the city hall too, and her husband Brian DeFranco is a Burlington police officer, and they did a block party in this area. So we're getting ready to come on our 6th annual block party. That's a huge event. Yeah, it's going to be great. Huge event, and it's all free to the community. So if there's somebody new coming out of treatment and they want to get some esteem back and they're not sure how, it's well, why don't you do some esteemable things and go volunteer at this thing and give out hot dogs to people, give out drinks. So I encourage people to connect with the Turning Point to see what's going on. I encourage people to connect with their faith-based communities, and then to also ask, there's so many social workers out there that are getting trained on what the resources are. But the Turning Point is a great recovery resource center. So they are connected with all these different nonprofit agencies that have events coming up that somebody can go in and it's a one-stop shop. Or they can find me on Facebook and messenger me and I'll tell them.
And any other question? Yeah, in the back. Okay.
Hi. I wanted to share a story from a different perspective. A few years ago, I was working as a zoning administrator in a small town, a medium-sized town in central Vermont. And there was a gentleman who had inherited his parents' house, and he came to me and said, I want to open a sober house. Do I need a permit? And I looked at the zoning regulations, and I felt like it didn't meet any of the definitions for a boarding house or a group home. And so I said, I don't think you need a permit to open a sober house. And he described what it would be. It would be a group of people living together that basically just wanted to support each other in being sober. And there was going to be no on-site medical assistance. And so it didn't fit any of our definitions of either a care home or didn't meet the definition of a boarding house, which was kind of this old term left over in the zoning. And there were some neighbors that were against this idea. They were fearful of what kind of people this would bring to their neighborhood. And the house was in a neighborhood, in town. There were sidewalks, people could walk places, they could catch the bus. And so I made a determination that, no, you don't need a permit, to have this house be a different type of residential use like that. And so the neighbors got together and they appealed my permit. And usually not many people come out to like DRB hearings, but the room was packed. We had like standing room only. And we heard from some of the neighbors, and they were really fearful about, who are these people that are going to live there? There was one woman who stood up and she said, I don't want people, like that. They're criminals, they're sex offenders. And she, obviously had like a lot of fear. But the majority of the people in the room were actually people from the community that we knew as business owners, as people we would see on the street. And they all stood up and they shared their story of recovery in support of the people that were going to live in this house. And that was really surprising to me, that many people came out, and I thought it was really great. Hopefully the people that had the fear kind of left with a different mindset. But I think there is kind of that crossover with not only what people's stigma is, but also kind of just making sure that the zoning regulations are clear enough to ensure that there aren't people that could come out and say, no, you need a permit, or that's not allowed. Because I think that that was something that obviously kind of came up during this process. So I just wanted to share kind of that story from a different perspective.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah, thanks. Any other last questions for Melinda before we break? Yeah.
So you had mentioned that family for you was not an influence as far as using. What is your suggestion for people who kind of have that, history in their family, and then they're trying to get sober, but the people who, they're very close with are still not at that point? Like, what is some advice?
Thanks.
That's a good one, and I'm going to give this advice as a person in recovery, not because of any place I work or serve on boards at. If somebody is new in recovery, being around somebody they're emotionally connected to that's still using is a life and death decision as far as I'm concerned. So for me personally, there were some people that I had to cut out of my life completely. And then there were some that I needed to cut out for a length of time, just for a season, until I had that solid foundation. So I deal with that with individuals today where they're in a relationship where the partner's still using, they go to treatment, they come out, and they're going to move back in with a partner. And, I can't just come out and say, well, why are you bothering going to treatment? Because, what's changed if nothing's changed? And yet, okay, no, it's always worth doing the right decision, even if you have the wrong intention, because it gets you to do the right decision. That being said, it's extremely difficult when people are basically going back to the same old, and they're changed, but others aren't changed. It adds that many more layers of difficulty. That being said, I also am not too closed-minded to think that some people are able to still do it when they are truly committed and following every single suggestion of their recovery. It's not like they're destined to pick up again if they go back to that, but the pain that they most likely will endure in trying to maintain their recovery and be around that same atmosphere is sad to me, that it's better to be alone and isolated, away from the people that were doing those things. I mean, I had to throw my phone away back in the day. I needed to go out of state. The person I got involved in drugs with ended up killing somebody the last time I went to treatment. I came out, we had parted ways, and he killed somebody over drugs. So it was only by, the grace of God that I got in treatment while he was still running. So that's just to say, if I would have moved back to him, I guarantee I would have been that driver. So it is, to me, I don't want to sound dramatic, but it is dramatic. It's life and death decision. So following the suggestions of being in a safe place, of having those different, have an escape route, have a sponsor, have safe supports. I even encourage people, if they say, well, I have to go to a wedding in 2 months and I've never gone without drinking or using drugs, don't go to the stinking wedding, because if you pick up again, there's a chance you might die and you're never going to go to any wedding. So I tend to be a little bit over the top with it if I'm sponsoring people, because it's essential for that first year to be your full-time job is your recovery, building that foundation. After that, you can ease into stuff. I mean, I'm a musician. I've gone out since I've been in recovery and played in clubs that serve alcohol, and it's like, it's good now. But I didn't do that the first year. My first year had to be 100% on recovery if I want to appreciate weddings and birthdays and holidays down the road. So I tend to say play it safe, because one bad decision in 1 week moment could take a life, and I see it every single day with our patients. So better safe than sorry.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Melinda. We appreciate you sharing. I mean, for some of us, yeah, thank you.